A fist swung hard toward Steven Seagal's jaw inside the rattling subway car, and before the knuckles could connect, the gangster's wrist was seized, twisted, and his entire body was launched across the aisle into the metal doors. The other thugs froze as their friend crumpled to the floor, and Seagal stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on every single one of them. What happened in the next 90 seconds would become New York's subway legend, a story whispered about for decades. The first fist came out of nowhere and caught Steven Seagal right on the side of his jaw. His head snapped left, his shoulder hit the subway pole, and 3 guys closed in around him before he could even register what city block was rolling past the window. What happened in the next 90 seconds would become New York City legend, a story whispered about in dojos and dive bars and precinct break rooms for decades. But let me back up, just a little, because you need to understand exactly how a 6'4" martial artist who'd already trained with some of the deadliest men in Japan ended up standing on a grimy late-night subway car looking like an easy mark. It was the early 1980s. Seagal wasn't famous yet. No movies, no ponytail pulled back tight for the camera, no leather jacket on a poster. He was just a big American guy who'd spent the better part of a decade living in Japan, running an Aikido dojo in Osaka, training under masters who could fold a man in half without breaking a sweat. He'd come back to the States not long before this night. He was trying to figure out what his life looked like in America again, and on this particular evening, he was riding the subway alone. Now here's what nobody tells you about New York in the early 80s. The subway system was a war zone. I'm not exaggerating. This wasn't the clean, surveillance camera, announcement every 30 seconds system you ride today. Graffiti covered every car inside and out. The lights flickered. Whole sections of certain lines were basically abandoned by law enforcement after dark. Crime stats from that era are staggering. Robberies on the subway were happening at a rate that would make your stomach drop. Muggings, assaults, stabbings. Riders knew the rules. You kept your head down. You didn't make eye contact. You sat near the conductor car if you could. And you absolutely, under no circumstances, rode alone after midnight unless you had no other choice. Seagal had no other choice. He'd been visiting someone on the Upper West Side. The visit ran late. He headed down into the station, waited on the platform under those yellow-sick fluorescent lights, and stepped onto a car that was nearly empty. Almost, because at the far end, sitting spread across the hard plastic seats, were 3 guys. Maybe 4. The accounts vary on the exact number, but most versions that trace back to people who actually knew Seagal put it at 3. They were young, they were loud, and they were scanning. Believe me, you know the look. If you've ever ridden a late-night train in any major city, you know exactly what scanning looks like. The head on a swivel, eyes measuring everyone who steps through those sliding doors, calculating who's drunk, who's distracted, who's carrying something worth taking. Seagal stepped on and grabbed the overhead bar. He was wearing a dark jacket, nothing flashy, but he was big, tall, and something about the way he held himself must have read wrong to them. Maybe it read as confidence, which on that subway line at that hour could be mistaken for arrogance. Or maybe they just didn't care. Maybe they'd done this 10 times that month and it always went the same way. The target freezes. The target hands over the wallet. The target sits down and stares at the floor, and thanks God it wasn't worse. They didn't know him. They didn't know what he'd spent the last 10 years doing. They didn't know that the man standing 6 inches from that greasy subway pole had been awarded a 7th Dan black belt in Aikido, one of the highest ranks any American had ever achieved in the art. They didn't know he'd spent years as an enforcer and instructor in a world where martial arts weren't a hobby or a fitness trend, but a way of life threaded through with real violence and real consequence. They saw a tall white guy alone on a train. That's all they needed to see. Get this. The first one stood up and walked toward Seagal with that loose, rolling walk that says, "I own this space." He didn't say a word at first, just stood too close, invaded the radius. That's the setup. It's a script as old as crime itself. One guy fronts, the other 2 flank. The target's eyes go to the guy in front, and by the time the hands come from the sides, it's already over. The guy in front finally spoke. "Yo, big man, you got the time?" Seagal looked at him, didn't answer immediately. His eyes tracked left and right, clocking the positions of the other 2 without turning his head. That's something trained fighters do instinctively. Peripheral assessment. You don't give away your awareness by moving your whole skull. You take in the geometry of the threat with your eyes alone. And the geometry here was bad. One in front at arm's length, one sliding up on his left, one hanging back on his right, probably the one with a weapon. "I don't have a watch," Seagal said. His voice was flat, no aggression, no fear, just flat. The guy in front took another half-step closer. "Then how about you give me what you do have?" It wasn't a question. It was an instruction. Seagal shifted his weight, slightly. If you weren't trained, you wouldn't have noticed. He moved his back foot about 2 inches to the right and bent his knees just a fraction. In Aikido, this is the beginning of everything. It's the base, the root from which all movement flows. He was grounding himself the way a tree sinks its hole deeper right before the wind hits. And then the wind hit. The guy on the left lunged first. That's when the fist connected. Side of the jaw, hard. Not a technically beautiful punch, but it didn't need to be. It was fast, and it was meant to stun, to drop the curtain on Seagal's decision-making ability while the others moved in. Here's the thing, though. Seagal's head snapped, yes. His shoulder hit the pole, yes. But his feet didn't move. His base held. And that's the detail that changes everything. I swear this happened. In the fraction of a second after that punch landed, Seagal's left hand came up and caught the attacker's wrist. Not slapped it, not grabbed it wild. Caught it. The way you'd catch a set of keys someone tossed to you without warning. Clean and precise. And then he turned it. Now, Aikido gets a lot of flack in the martial arts community. People call it performative. They say it doesn't work in real fights, that it's all choreography and compliant training partners. And maybe in the hands of a weekend hobbyist, there's some truth to that criticism. But in the hands of a man who'd trained full contact in Japan for a decade under masters, who treated the art as a combat discipline and not a dance class, Aikido becomes something entirely different. It becomes physics applied to joints. It becomes the redirection of force so efficient that your own attack becomes the weapon used against you. The wrist turned, the guy's elbow locked, and Seagal drove him downward and sideways into the subway floor with a kotegaeshi that used the attacker's own forward momentum to multiply the impact. The guy hit the ground, and the sound his body made against that floor was a thick, flat crack. Not his bones, not yet. Just the sheer force of a full-grown man being planted into a hard surface by someone who understood exactly how much torque a human wrist joint could take before it started to come apart. The guy screamed, briefly, then went very still. No kidding, the whole thing took maybe 2 seconds. The other two froze. And this is the moment, this is the exact frame where the story pivots. Because up until now, the three of them held all the power. They'd chosen the target, they'd set the trap, they'd thrown the first punch. Everything was going according to their playbook. And now one of them was face down on a subway floor, making a sound that wasn't quite crying but wasn't far from it. And the big guy who was supposed to fold was standing there with his knees still bent, his base still set, looking at the remaining two with an expression that communicated something very simple. "Your turn." Listen to me. The second attacker didn't wait long. Maybe he figured his friend just got unlucky. Maybe he figured size and numbers still mattered. He pulled something from his waistband. Some accounts say it was a knife, others say it was a box cutter, which in 1980s New York was practically standard issue for subway predators. Either way, a blade came out. Steel caught the flicker of those dying overhead lights. He slashed forward. Quick, horizontal, aiming for Seagal's midsection. Seagal didn't block the blade. He moved offline. That's the Aikido term for it, but what it really means is he stepped diagonally out of the path of the attack while simultaneously closing the distance. Counterintuitive, right? Most people's instinct when a knife comes at them is to back up, create space, get away from the sharp thing. But Seagal moved toward it, just to the side of it, and as the blade arm extended past him, he did something devastating. He caught the knife arm at the wrist and elbow simultaneously, applied a lock called Nikyo, and twisted. The physics of Nikyo are brutal. You're rotating the wrist inward while pressing down on the back of the hand and levering the elbow. It puts pressure on the wrist, the forearm, the elbow, and the shoulder all at once. There's no muscling out of it. There's no toughness that helps. The pain is so immediate and so complete that the body's only response is to drop. The knife clattered to the subway floor. The second attacker went to his knees, his face twisted, his mouth open but nothing coming out because the pain had gone past the point where sound helps. Seagal held the lock for a beat, just a beat. Then he released and the guy crumpled sideways, cradling his arm against his chest. 2 down. Under 10 seconds total. The subway car rocking on its rails, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and the third guy standing about 8 feet away watching his entire worldview collapse. You have to understand something. The third guy had probably done this dozens of times. He and his crew had probably robbed 50, 60, maybe 100 people on these trains. And every single time the script worked, the intimidation worked, the numbers worked, the violence worked. People gave up their wallets, their watches, their jewelry, their dignity, and they went home and tried to forget about it. That was the transaction. That was how the city operated after dark. But this wasn't following the script. This was something else entirely. The third attacker took a step back. His heel hit the base of one of the seats. Seagal took a step forward, not aggressive, not charging, just one step, closing the distance by about 30 inches. And he said nothing, didn't posture, didn't threaten, didn't say something cool for the audience because there was no audience. Just those buzzing lights and the rattle of the train and 2 guys on the ground behind him. True story. The third guy ran. He turned and bolted down the length of the car toward the connecting door, yanked it open, disappeared into the next car, gone. Just like that, the threat evaporated. The balance of power hadn't just shifted, it had inverted completely. 3 predators had cornered what they thought was prey, and in less time than it takes to tie your shoes, 2 of them were on the floor, and the third was running like the train was on fire. Seagal stood there for a moment. The first guy, the one who'd thrown the punch, was starting to push himself up off the floor. Seagal looked down at him. And here's where the story gets the detail that makes it human, the detail that separates this from just another fight video. Seagal reached down and helped the guy sit up, grabbed his jacket and pulled him into a sitting position against the row of seats. The guy looked up at him, his wrist already swelling, his face a mess of confusion and pain and something that might have been the beginning of fear catching up to his brain. And Seagal asked him if he was all right. Think about that. The man who'd just been sucker punched, who'd just been attacked by 3 people on a deserted subway car, who'd just been threatened with a blade, asked his attacker if he was all right. This wasn't weakness. This wasn't some Hollywood script moment designed to make the hero look noble. This was a martial artist trained in a discipline whose entire philosophy centers on the idea that you neutralize threats without destroying people. Aikido literally translates to the way of harmonious spirit. It's built on the principle that the ideal resolution to conflict is one where nobody gets permanently damaged, even the attacker, especially the attacker. The guy didn't answer, he just stared. His buddy with the wrecked arm was making his way to standing, moving toward the doors, clearly done. The train was pulling into a station. The brakes hissed, the doors slid open. The 2 attackers stumbled off the train and onto the platform, one holding his wrist, the other clutching his arm against his body. They moved into the station and disappeared up the stairs, and Seagal stayed on the car, alone again. The doors closed. The train lurched forward. He picked up the knife from the floor, held it for a moment, then dropped it into the gap between the platform and the train as the car pulled away. Now, here's what happened after. And this is the part of the story that matters almost as much as the fight itself, because it tells you who Seagal was before the world decided to turn him into something else. He didn't call the cops. He didn't report the incident. He didn't go home and call everyone he knew and tell them about the time he destroyed 3 muggers on a subway. He went home and went to bed. He mentioned it to a few people at his dojo the next day, casually, the way you'd mention a weird interaction with a taxi driver. Oh yeah, some guys tried to mug me on the train. It was fine. That's it. That was his version of the story. It was fine. The full account came out later, in pieces, told by training partners and friends and eventually by journalists who tracked down the details when Seagal started becoming famous. Because here's the thing people forget, when this subway incident happened, Steven Seagal was nobody, public nobody. He was a guy who ran a small Aikido school and worked as a martial arts coordinator. He didn't have an agent, he didn't have a headshot. He wasn't even thinking about movies yet. The movie thing came later. A few years after this night, a man named Michael Ovitz walked into Seagal's dojo. Ovitz wasn't just any man. He was the co-founder of Creative Artists Agency, the single most powerful talent agency in Hollywood at the time. Ovitz had been training in Aikido himself and had heard about this American who'd done something almost unprecedented in Japan, running his own dojo, earning a seventh dan, gaining the respect of Japanese masters who traditionally kept the highest levels of the art closed to foreigners. Ovitz watched Seagal demonstrate, and what he saw was a movie star, not because Seagal was pretty or charismatic in the traditional Hollywood sense, but because when Seagal moved, when he threw people, when he locked joints and redirected force, there was a brutal elegance to it that the camera would love. This wasn't the karate chops and high kicks that American audiences were used to from martial arts films. This was something new. Something that looked effortless and devastating at the same time. Something real. Ovitz made a call, then another call, and within a few years Seagal was starring in Above the Law, his first feature film, playing essentially a version of himself, a martial artist who operates outside the rules and makes bad guys pay for underestimating him. The movie did well enough. Then came Hard to Kill. Then came the one that changed everything, Under Siege, where Seagal played a Navy cook who turns out to be a former SEAL and single-handedly takes back a battleship from terrorists. Now mark this. That Under Siege plot, the idea of a dangerous man being mistaken for someone harmless, someone whose true capabilities are invisible until the moment violence finds him, that's the Subway story. That's the exact dynamic. Bad guys walk up to a guy they think is nothing. They push, they threaten, they throw the first punch, and then the world flips upside down and they find out they've made the worst miscalculation of their lives. Seagal lived that script before anyone ever wrote it for him. But here's where I've got to be honest with you. Real talk. The man's legacy is complicated. By the 2000s, Seagal's public image had curdled. There were allegations of misconduct. There were business entanglements that raised eyebrows. His movies went straight to DVD, and the quality dropped off a cliff. He gained weight. He showed up in bizarre reality TV projects. He got cozy with political figures that made a lot of people uncomfortable. The guy who once embodied cool, efficient, righteous force became a punchline in a lot of circles. And that matters. It matters because this isn't a fairy tale. This is a real person with a real arc, and arcs bend in directions you don't always want them to. The man on the subway that night was somebody specific, focused, trained, controlled, capable of immense violence but choosing precision over destruction. The man who emerged on the other side of fame and money and power didn't always make the same choices. But the subway moment exists outside all of that. It sits in its own space, preserved, because it happened before any of the noise, before the celebrity, before the controversy, before the memes. It's just a man on a train, 3 attackers who picked the wrong target, and 90 seconds that demonstrated what a lifetime of disciplined training can do when reality shows up with a fist and a blade and bad intentions. You want to know the wildest part? For real. The story almost never got told at all. Seagal didn't put it in interviews for years. It was his training partners and early students who kept it alive. One of them, a guy who trained under Seagal in the mid-'80s, told a version of it to a journalist in the early 90s when Seagal was blowing up in Hollywood. The journalist tried to confirm it with Seagal, and Seagal apparently shrugged and said something to the effect of things like that happened. Things like that. Plural. Which means the subway wasn't the only time. It was just the one that stuck because the details were vivid, and the witnesses, those 2 guys on the ground and the one who ran, presumably told their own version of the story to their own circles. And those circles talked, and the talk became legend. In dojos across America, the subway story became a teaching moment. Instructors used it to illustrate a principle that every martial art talks about but few students ever actually experience. The principle that real mastery is invisible until it's needed. You don't walk around broadcasting your training. You don't posture. You don't flex. You carry it silently, the way a surgeon carries the ability to open your chest and repair your heart without mentioning it at dinner parties. It's just there, dormant, until the moment arrives when it's the only thing standing between you and catastrophe. And when that moment came for Seagal, on a rattling, graffiti-covered subway car somewhere beneath Manhattan, he didn't panic. He didn't freeze. He didn't fight with anger or ego. He fought with technique. He fought with years of muscle memory so deeply embedded that his body responded before his conscious mind had time to draft a plan. The wrist catch, the redirect, the joint lock, the control. None of it was thought. All of it was trained. There's a massive difference. If you've been watching this far, do me a favor. Hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me about a time someone underestimated you. Not a fight necessarily, just a moment where someone looked at you and saw the wrong thing. I read every single one. Now let me finish this. The train kept moving. The city kept grinding. Somewhere above, taxis were honking and steam was rising from manhole covers and millions of people were sleeping or drinking or fighting or falling in love. Below ground, on a subway car now empty except for one man, Steven Seagal rode toward his stop. He had a sore jaw. He had a story he probably wasn't going to tell. And he had the quiet, unshakable knowledge of something that most people will never understand. He knew exactly what he was capable of. Not because someone told him, not because a belt said so, not because a camera was rolling, but because 3 men had tried to break him, and he'd answered with a precision that turned their violence into their own defeat. He'd felt the resistance in their joints. He'd controlled the speed of their descent. He'd chosen, consciously and deliberately, to cause enough damage to stop the threat but not enough to ruin a life. That's mastery, not the ability to destroy, the ability to choose not to. The train pulled into his station. He stood up, rolled his jaw once, testing the soreness, stepped through the doors onto the platform, walked up the stairs and out into the New York night, where the cold air hit his face and the city swallowed him whole. Nobody on the street looked twice. Nobody had any idea. Just a big guy in a dark jacket, walking home late, nothing to see. But underneath that jacket, underneath that calm exterior, was a man who had just demonstrated something that years later would make him famous, that would fill movie theaters and sell millions of tickets and launch an entire franchise of films built around a single, irresistible premise. The premise that the most dangerous person in the room is the one you never suspect. Seagal didn't create that idea. It's as old as storytelling, David and Goliath. The shepherd boy nobody believed could fight, but Seagal lived it. On that train, in that moment, he was the proof of concept. And every film he made afterward, every villain who sneered at the quiet guy in the corner before getting his arm bent in a direction God never intended, that was all an echo of the subway. That was all a recreation of the night. 3 guys picked the one person on a New York City train who was ready. Years later, in one of his rare moments of candor about the incident, Seagal reportedly said 5 words that people who were there never forgot. They should have stayed seated. That's it. That's all he gave them. No war story, no play-by-play, no chest-thumping victory lap. 5 words, under 15, delivered flat, and then he changed the subject. Because the man who lived through that moment didn't need to talk about it. The moment spoke for itself. It spoke through 2 injured attackers who limped off a subway platform into the night. It spoke through a third who ran so fast he probably didn't stop until he was home with the door locked and the chain on. It spoke through every training partner who heard the account and understood, viscerally, why they showed up to the dojo every morning at 5 a.m. to practice wrist locks and throws and redirections until their bodies could do them without thinking. The subway story is why the legend exists. Not the movies, not the fame, not the controversies that came later and will follow Seagal's name into whatever history decides to do with him. The legend started underground, in the dark, on a train that smelled of old metal and strangers' sweat. It started with a punch that should have ended a robbery, and instead started a chain reaction that would eventually reach all the way to Hollywood. 3 gangsters got on a subway looking for a victim. They found one. They just didn't understand that the victim was them, and somewhere in the miles of tunnel beneath New York City, that story still rides the rails, invisible, dormant, waiting for someone to tell it. Now you've heard it, and trust me, you won't forget it.